Everyone knows the name Nora Honor, the superstar, the icon, the legend. But what most people know is only the version that made it to the screen. The truth is, the more famous she became, the harder she was to understand. She didn't explain herself. She didn't correct rumors. And she never tried to fit into the image the industry wanted from her. Behind the performances were choices that confused people, silences that spoke louder than statements, and moments that made fans feel closer to her, while leaving others completely shut out. Even now, long after her biggest roles, conversations about Nora Honor still feel unfinished. Not because her career lacked impact, but because so much about her remained unspoken. And maybe that was intentional. Before we get into it, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our uploads. We break down stories like this all the time, and you'll want to be here when the next one drops. Because to really understand Nora Honor, you have to start with something surprisingly simple, a nickname that said everything. That idea of Nora Aunor being both close and distant starts with a name almost everyone used, At Guy. At first, it didn't sound like something meant for a superstar. It wasn't glamorous or carefully crafted. Guy was a nickname that followed her naturally, tied to her tomboyish energy and the way she moved through the world without trying to impress anyone. It wasn't a stage name built for marketing. It was something people around her genuinely called her. When fame arrived, fans added Ate, not to elevate her, but to claim her. In Filipino culture, ate is a term of respect and familiarity at the same time. It implies closeness, guidance, and trust. By calling her Ate Guy, supporters weren't just acknowledging her status. They were saying she still felt like one of them. That's what made the nickname powerful. While other stars felt distant and untouchable, Nora felt present, approachable. Even when she was selling out films and dominating charts, the way people referred to her never changed. Directors, co-stars, and fans alike reportedly used the same name, blurring the line between legend and everyday person. This wasn't accidental. Nora never pushed herself above her audience. She didn't rebrand or reinvent the nickname to sound more star-like. She let it stay exactly as it was, simple and familiar. And that closeness created something rare, loyalty that felt personal. But it also placed her in a strange position. Because while audiences embraced her as family, the industry was quietly asking a different question. What exactly was she supposed to be? And that question would follow her for the rest of her career. But audiences responded in a way the industry didn't predict. People didn't just watch Nora, they related to her. She felt familiar, grounded, real. Instead of escaping into a fantasy, viewers saw pieces of themselves reflected back at them. And that connection turned out to be far more powerful than polish. Ironically, the very traits that made studios hesitate were the same ones that made her impossible to replace. She didn't represent an ideal, she represented truth. And that shifted expectations in ways no press campaign ever could. As her popularity grew, the tension didn't disappear, it deepened. She was successful, but not on the industry's terms. Celebrated, yet still questioned. A superstar who refused to be reshaped. And that refusal didn't come from rebellion or defiance. It came naturally. Because the same person who didn't fit the industry's image of a star also didn't behave the way a star was expected to behave, especially once the cameras stopped rolling. And that contrast became impossible to ignore. Contrast became clear the moment people worked with her. Off camera, Nora Honor was known to be extremely quiet. She didn't dominate conversations, didn't command rooms, and didn't move like someone aware of her own fame. On set, she often kept to herself, observing more than speaking. New co-stars sometimes didn't know how to read her silence, unsure whether it meant focus, distance, or something else entirely. Then the cameras turned on. Without warning, the stillness disappeared. Her posture changed. Her eyes sharpened. The same person who barely spoke moments earlier suddenly filled the frame with intensity. Directors have described it as almost jarring, like watching someone switch identities in real time. There was no build-up, no performance of confidence, just presence. Working with Nora meant surrendering control. You couldn't force a performance out of her. You had to trust that when the camera rolled, she would deliver something real, even if you didn't fully understand how she got there. But that approach didn't stop with her presence. It extended into the way she acted itself. And that acting style would leave even experienced directors unsure of what to expect next. Nora Honor didn't act the way most performers were trained to. She wasn't known for obsessively memorizing every line or repeating scenes the same way twice. Instead, she focused on something harder to control: emotion. She wanted to understand what a scene felt like, not just how it sounded on paper. This approach made some directors nervous. There were reports of moments when scenes felt unpredictable, even risky. She might pause longer than expected, deliver a line softer, let silence do the work. On paper, it didn't always make sense. On camera, it often felt devastatingly real. Because of that, rehearsals with her could feel misleading. What you saw before the take wasn't always what you got during it. And for directors used to precision and planning, that lack of control was unsettling. But when the final footage came together, the results were hard to argue with. Her performances didn't feel performed. They felt lived in, like the camera had caught something private rather than staged. That realism became her signature. Some filmmakers learned to trust the process. Others struggled with it. But one thing became clear. Working with Nora meant letting go of rigid expectations. And that same instinct, refusing to force herself into systems that didn't feel right, didn't stop at acting. It showed up in her career choices, too. Because when something felt wrong, Nora Honor didn't try to fix it. She walked away, and that decision would change how the industry saw her forever. That silence became impossible to ignore when controversy followed her offset and into the public eye. In the mid-2000s, reports surfaced involving Nora Aunor and a legal issue in the United States. The story spread quickly, but the details remained murky. Headlines multiplied, opinions hardened, and once again, people waited for Nora to explain herself. She didn't. There were no emotional interviews, no carefully crafted statements. According to reports, the situation was eventually resolved through legal processes. But by then, the damage was already done. Speculation had filled the space where clarity should have been. And in the court of public opinion, silence was interpreted in every possible way.
At least yun na yung wala nagsusunod dun kaya parang.
That controversy would later resurface in discussions about why her recognition as a national artist took so long. Supporters argued her body of work spoke for itself. Critics claimed the issue overshadowed everything else. The debate grew louder, more divisive, yet Nora remained absent from it. To some, that refusal to engage felt irresponsible. To others, it felt deeply personal. As if she was drawing a line between her work and her private life, refusing to let the public decide where one ended and the other began. What made it even more striking was how consistent she was. No clarification, no apology tour, no attempt to control the narrative. And while that silence cost her in certain moments, it also revealed something important. Because even when the world questioned her the loudest, there was one group that never wavered. Her fans didn't need explanations. They had already chosen their side. And what they became in those moments would surprise even the industry itself. That unwavering support didn't come from marketing or image control. It came from something much deeper. Noranians weren't passive fans who showed up only when things were easy. They were present during the silence, the controversies, and the long gaps when Nora Honor disappeared from the spotlight. When criticism grew louder, their loyalty grew stronger. And when explanations never came, they didn't demand them. To them, Nora wasn't just a superstar. She was ate guy, someone they felt emotionally connected to, not because she shared everything, but because she never pretended to be anyone else. Her struggles felt familiar, her quietness felt honest, and her refusal to perform vulnerability for the public only made that bond stronger.
Walang himala!
So yung aming napanood na walang himala, take 1 yun, Tigay.
Take 1 po.
Wow.
Kasi hindi pwede mag-take 2.
This loyalty showed up everywhere. Film screenings reportedly turned into communal experiences, with fans reacting emotionally to every scene. Online spaces filled with debates, where Noranians defended her legacy with precision, history, and passion. Award snubs didn't weaken them. They mobilized them. What confused outsiders was the depth of it. Why defend someone who wouldn't speak for herself? Why stay loyal through uncertainty? The answer was simple. They trusted her long before the world questioned her. They believed her work carried truth, even when words were absent. In many ways, Noranians became her shield. They absorbed criticism so she didn't have to. They carried the narrative when she chose not to. And that bond didn't fade with time. But long before the films, the controversies, or the fan movement, there was something else that connected Nora to people instantly. Something so recognizable, it didn't need a face. It only needed a few seconds. Her voice. That connection didn't need explanations. It didn't even need a screen. For many people, Nora Honor's presence was recognizable within seconds, simply by hearing her voice. It wasn't polished in the traditional sense. It wasn't overly powerful or technically perfect, but it carried something far more rare, emotional truth. You could hear vulnerability in it, weariness, strength, and a kind of sincerity that felt unfiltered. On the radio, listeners didn't need introductions. A few notes were enough. Her voice sounded lived in, like it had a story behind every word. That quality helped her stand out in a time when many singers aimed for perfection rather than feeling. And it's why her songs didn't just entertain, they stayed with people, stayed.
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
What made her voice even more powerful was how it carried into her acting. She knew when to soften it, when to let it break, when silence mattered more than sound. Even in dialogue-heavy scenes, her delivery felt intimate, almost conversational, as if she were speaking directly to one person instead of an audience. Fans often said they didn't just hear her, they felt her. That emotional connection became part of her identity, inseparable from who she was as an artist. But that deep attachment also meant something else. When that voice began to change, people noticed immediately. Not because it was announced, not because it was explained, but because something familiar suddenly felt different. And for someone whose voice had become such a powerful symbol of connection, that shift would quietly mark one of the most difficult turning points of her life. Because when a voice that defined you begins to fade, everything else has to change too. That change didn't arrive with an announcement or an explanation. It arrived quietly, and fans felt it before anyone talked about it. Over time, listeners noticed her singing less. Performances sounded different. Appearances tied to music became rare. Eventually, reports began circulating that a cosmetic procedure may have affected her vocal cords. Nora Honor never fully addressed it herself, but the shift was impossible to ignore. For an artist whose voice had been such a powerful extension of her identity, this wasn't just a technical issue. It was personal. What made this moment so striking was how she handled it. She didn't dramatize the loss. She didn't ask for sympathy. And she didn't try to force a comeback built around what she could no longer do. Instead, she adapted. Quietly. She leaned deeper into acting, choosing roles that relied on restraint, silence, and emotional weight rather than sound. In a way, her performances became even more internal. Where her voice once carried emotion, her eyes did the work now. Pauses lasted longer. Scenes felt heavier. It was as if she redirected everything she could no longer express through singing into something more controlled, and sometimes more haunting.
This time, a duet from our superstar Nora Honor and Gary Valenciano.
Fans mourned the loss, but they followed her anyway. Because what mattered wasn't the voice itself. It was the honesty behind it, and that honesty never disappeared. Still, this moment marked a clear shift. After this, Nora became even more private, even more selective, even more distant from public explanations. And as the years went on, that distance only grew, which is why when questions began surrounding her final years, they didn't feel sudden at all. They felt like the continuation of a story that had always resisted clarity. That resistance to clarity followed Nora Honor into the final chapter of her life. In her later years, she slowly pulled away from the public eye. Appearances became rare. Interviews were almost non-existent. When she did surface, it was brief and carefully controlled, offering little insight into how she was really doing. For longtime fans, this wasn't shocking. It felt familiar. Silence had always been part of how she moved through the world. So when news of her passing surfaced, it didn't bring the kind of closure people expected. Official statements pointed to health-related complications, but almost immediately, questions began circulating online. Fans revisited past struggles. Others speculated about the toll of years spent under pressure, scrutiny, and physical strain. As always, there were more theories than confirmed answers. And once again, Nora wasn't there to clarify anything. What stood out was how divided the reaction became. Some accepted the facts as presented. Others focused on what was never explained, never addressed, never resolved. The same pattern that followed her entire career resurfaced one last time. Admiration mixed with uncertainty.
Ang gusto ko lang maiparating sa mga taong nagmamahal, nagsusuporta at umiintindi sa aming ina.
But for those who truly followed her, the unanswered questions didn't feel frustrating. They felt consistent, almost expected. Nora had never belonged fully to the public, even at her most famous. And maybe that distance was intentional, a final boundary she never allowed anyone to cross. Because not every story is meant to be explained, and not every legend leaves behind answers. Some leave behind questions, and the echoes of a life that was lived entirely on its own terms. And that's what brings us to the final truth about Nora Honor. Those unanswered questions are exactly why Nora Honor's story still lingers. Most legends eventually become easy to explain. Their lives get summarized into awards, milestones, and familiar narratives. Nora resisted that. She didn't offer clarity when people expected it. She didn't smooth out contradictions. And she never tried to make herself easier to understand. She was a superstar who stayed grounded. A private person who remained endlessly discussed. someone whose silence carried as much weight as her performances. And instead of closing the book on her story, she left space for interpretation, reflection, and debate.
Direct, sabi ko, next year pa nga ako, gagawa mo ako ng pelikula. Tinupad naman niya.
Maybe that's why her legacy feels alive. Not frozen in the past, but constantly rediscovered. Each generation sees something different in her work because she never told audiences what to think. She trusted them to feel. Nora Honor doesn't feel unfinished because something is missing. She feels unfinished because her story was never meant to end cleanly. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like the video, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future uploads. We have more stories like this coming, and you won't want to miss what's next.